Good evening. My name is Grace Hayek, and on behalf of the Glencoe Public Library, I welcome you to our program tonight on revival architecture and its ancient derivatives. Thank you to the Friends of the Glencoe Public Library for co-sponsoring this program and for funding so many other programs that because of them, we are allowed to present. Our presenter tonight is Dr. Foy Scalf. He is the head of the Research Archives Library at the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, which we are going to call ISAC. It's formerly known as the Oriental Institute, and it's down at the University of Chicago. All right, they changed their name. Foy studied Egyptology at the University of Chicago, where he wrote a dissertation on demotic funerary papyri dating from the first and 2nd century CE Egypt. He has published on many topics, including Egyptian grammar, philology, demotic texts, magic, and religion. He also leads ISAC's Integrated Database Project. He teaches classes for the ISAC Museum Education Department and also lectures in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago and the School of Information Studies at Dominican University. Foy's given several programs for the library, most recently in February 2023, when he delivered a very interesting one on hieroglyphics that's still available on the library's YouTube channel. You can look it up. And he will be back in October talking about mummies. But this is his first time back in the library building for a long time, and you are very, very welcome back. And I want you to take it from here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be back. And I guess technically speaking, the program in October will be about the mummy, because we'll be talking about, do you want this on? Sorry. The character that you know from, let's say, movies and comic books, and we'll be connecting that with its ancient Egyptian past and how that character was sort of born, mostly, let's say, in the 19th century in short stories and then in film later on. But today we're talking about revival architecture, specifically for my area of interest and specialization, Egyptian revival architecture, although the Egyptian revival in its various phases is very closely connected to the neoclassical revival architecture as well, which you'll see as we go through some of the examples of this that we're looking at. Now, just to sort of whet your appetite, there's plenty of Egyptian revival architecture from different periods right here in the Chicagoland area. One of the best known is the Reby storage warehouse. Here you can see this, again, I'll talk more about the phases that we can look at for Egyptian revival style, but this is in the Art Deco style, so in the 1920s and later, and it's even set up with hieroglyphic inscriptions. What you see in the bottom right actually names the brothers, the Reby brothers, so it says Reby brother on it. It's actually just spelled out here in the hieroglyphs and then the word for brother following it. And there's a full set of inscriptions running around these two pharaonic-like statues on the sides that they must have commissioned from somebody who knew something about hieroglyphs. They're not perfectly composed, and they look like perhaps somebody was looking up. There was a dictionary that was well known at the time that was produced by a man named Budge, and he had produced a hieroglyphic dictionary. So it looks like somebody sort of looked up words in the dictionary and cobbled these things together, but you can actually read them. One of the inscriptions says, "I have put protection upon your furniture and all your sealed things," so the stuff that you store in Reby storehouse, "and I have guarded all your property every day, warding off devouring flames. Likewise," that should say robbery, but it's getting cut off right at the bottom just a little bit. And according to some of the Chicago guidebooks, we actually find out that Reby's slogan was, "If old King Tut were alive today, he'd store his goods the Reby way." So you can see how this Egyptian revival style, particularly in the Art Deco period, is being used. And back about 30 years ago, there was a commission where they developed a report about incorporating the Reby storage warehouse as a historical landmark, which did go through. And I just wanted to point out they're not just there to store things, but here is actually an accession card from our museum. Notice who the shipper is. Reby Storage and Moving Company, and look what they're moving, a limestone relief of a queen or goddess. So these people actually were moving ancient Egyptian artifacts around for our museum at the time, in addition to being a storage warehouse that had an Egyptian revival design on the outside. So in addition to something like Reby Storage, just to show you a couple of other ones, this is the Egyptian Lacquer Company. This is there today. This is from a Google Street View image. This was founded in 1876. The building was completed in 1926, or I should say the company was founded in 1876. The building was completed in 1926. It's now called Egyptian Coatings. This is in East Garfield Park on West Carroll Avenue. Again, you can see the Egyptian design. Here's an old advertisement for them. And if you look closely, we have this very interesting sphinx inside the sun disk at the top. This was actually sculpted by a man named Fritz Albert. He was a German sculptor who actually came to the Americas to work on the 1893 World Columbian Exposition, and then ended up doing some other designs around the city, including, by the way, parts of Reby Storage he was working on for them as well. And this particular Egyptian lacquer company, the outside, they have also replica ancient Egyptian inscriptions and hieroglyphs. What you see on the left is a rubbing that was done by my former professor, Robert Rittner, from our institute, who's now unfortunately deceased, where he was studying some of these to kind of figure out their origins and see where they were from. And the company, which is now headquartered in Tennessee, you can still see here on their this is their website today, Egyptian Coatings, and they're still all Egyptian themed inside and out, even their company logo. Just to give you again one other example of this before we move on to sort of maybe give you the context for this kind of Egyptian revival. There's the Onan Pyramid House. Probably many of you have heard of this. This is from a Google satellite view. Here's from the fence outside the main house, and you can see the large monumental statue next to the 5-story pyramid house that they have there, which unfortunately in, I think it was 2018 or 15 suffered a really bad fire. And then they had to rebuild. That's what you see on the right, the left where it was damaged by fire. And then where they rebuilt, you can go there and visit this place now and even buy their products, such as the Gold Pyramid water, or if that's not suitable for you, the Gold Pyramid vodka, right off of their website. So these couple of examples up front is just to kind of show you how popular this is and how ubiquitous it is. This kind of architectural style is literally all over the United States, particularly from the East Coast to the Midwest. Less so, especially for earlier periods past the Midwest. And that's because, as you'll see when we start talking about this, is a lot of this architectural style was built in between about 1850 and about 15 for one phase, and then that Art Deco phase after. So for this slightly earlier phase in America, the pre-Art Deco phase, obviously, you're not going to get a lot of that on the West Coast, right? You're going to get that up through the Midwest, and then it sort of stops. You'll get more of that Art Deco material on the West Coast. So one thing that I want to point out is this interest in ancient Egypt that we're getting in the colonial period, let's say the late colonial period, into the Civil War period in the United States, has a very long history. And I just want to point out a few things. I don't want to go too deep into this. We don't have time to do that, but I just want to point out a few things about where this is coming from in its derivations. And the first thing I would say, I guess, if you take nothing else away from what we're going to talk about tonight, know that interest in the history and culture of ancient Egypt started in ancient Egypt itself and then never really stopped. So even when we talk about Egyptomania, and I'll even talk about here in a minute, like phases of Egyptomania, the reality is the ancient Egyptians themselves had an interest in their ancient past, and that was passed on to basically many cultures that were their neighbors or who had visited Egypt, and that's what gets passed on to us. So what you're seeing here on the screen is a famous ancient Egyptian. His name was Kamwasit. You see his name in hieroglyphs under the statue of him here. And one thing he was famous for was going around and finding old ancient Egyptian buildings that had been sort of fallen into decay or forgotten, and then putting new inscriptions on them to identify who built them and why they were there. So what you see in the middle is one of these inscriptions that was put in on an old kingdom pyramid. So Kamwasit lived, let's say, around 1100-ish BC, and he's going back and adding an inscription to a pyramid from about 2200 BC. to say who built it, why it's there, the date of it, and all of that. So it's almost like an open air museum if you think about it. So Kamwasit was already had quote unquote Egyptomania, right, for his own past and his own culture. And we even have a much later story you see on the right side. This is a Demotic papyrus or papyrus inscribed with this Demotic story that we call the Tale of Set Nakamwas. And part of the tale, the main character, Set Nakamwas, is going around and reading inscriptions from ancient monuments in Egypt. And this tale is getting passed around in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. So let's say between 300 BC and about 200 AD, they're telling stories about this real ancient person, but now who's become a character in these narrative tales. So interest in ancient Egyptian history already begins in ancient Egypt. Of course, that gets passed to other cultures like Rome. What you're seeing here on the screen is actually a metal tablet. Sometimes it's called the Bambina tablet after someone who owned it, or it's also called the Mensa Isiaca, or the Isis table. And here's a zoomed out view of it. What this was actually made in Rome for the Temple of Isis in Rome. And all the hieroglyphic inscription that you see there doesn't say anything. They're pseudo hieroglyphs. So they were produced by a priest in Rome who had an infatuation with Egyptian culture and served probably the Isis, the goddess Isis, in the cult there, and made this in their honor. And this became an important piece in the Italian Renaissance because it gets discovered again in the 16th century. And then people use it to inspire new study of ancient Egypt in the Italian Renaissance. One of the cardinals, his name was Pietro Bembo. That's where we get the name Bambina tablet. He purchases this or acquires it, and then people start studying it in the Renaissance period. Likewise, those same Romans, people like Diodorus Siculus, the famous historian, he visits Egypt in maybe, let's say, around 50 BC, and he writes a poem about, or a short account about giant statues that are near the tombs in a city called Thebes. That actually later inspires Percy Shelley to write the poem Ozymandias. So that whole poem Ozymandias is based on this classical writer, Diodorus Siculus, who visited Thebes, and Percy Shelley also was partially inspired by the little inset photo that you see in the middle, which is a sculpture often referred to as Younger Memnon. It comes from that same site where you see the large fallen statue on the left. That's the site called the Ramesseum. That was a temple to Ramses II. And just around the time that Percy Shelley writes that poem, a number of prominent individuals, Henry Salt, who's the consul of Egypt, and he's working with a guy named Belzoni, who was a famous sort of circus strongman. They haul away this Younger Memnon statue back to the British Museum, and there's press about it, and that's also plays a role in Percy Shelley getting inspired to use Diodorus Siculus as inspiration for this Ozymandias poem. And so you see, again, this stretch of time of interest from ancient Egypt to Rome to people in the West. Same thing that you see on the right side, these two obelisks that are standing in Rome today. I mean, one thing that's always surprising to people is that there's more standing obelisks in Rome than ancient Egypt, and then, sorry, in Egypt today. Many of them were drug away by the Romans to Italy. And so these two were set up in the 17th century. The one in the middle, very famous, probably inspired by a woodcut illustration from a 1499 book that if you want to talk about, we can talk about more. But these are actual ancient obelisks that were discovered in Rome and then re-erected in the 17th century by popes and other people like Bernini, the famous sculptor who made the bottom portions to hold these obelisks. So again, I'm just showing you that this is a long connected series of interest in ancient Egypt that also included people writing in Arabic, as you can imagine, who were from Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East. And so what you see here is a few different, the three images on the left, all from one particular book that's called the Book of the Seven Climes. Climes being related to like our sense of latitude, so different parts of geography, but it's basically an alchemical work. And what you see on the very left, if you look closely, is somebody who was writing this was looking at a real ancient Egyptian inscription and trying to copy it down. So you can sort of see the falcon on top of a rectangular piece there with the hieroglyphs inside. So they're looking at these hieroglyphic inscriptions and getting ideas about them. And then this one on the far right, you see that there's a couple hieroglyphs with Arabic letters underneath. This was a book about occult alphabets that was written in the 10th century by a scholar named Ibn Washia. And this isn't, well, let me say it this way. What this turns out to be is a cipher script where they're using inspiration from ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs to encode secret knowledge in these alchemical manuscripts. So all of these people are influenced by this tradition coming out of ancient Egypt. That includes, for example, again, in the Italian Renaissance and moving past that, there's a number of works that are discovered at that time. And again, if you guys have questions, it's only a few of us, so I'm happy to, if we wanted to take a detour, but there's a number of important works that are discovered at the time that reference ancient Egypt in some way. And these help influence Renaissance scholars looking back to the past. They start looking back to ancient Egypt, so much so that there's a scholar named Aeneas of Viterbo who actually writes a genealogy for the popes, you know, right, in the Vatican, that they are descended from the Egyptian god Osiris, right? So this sort of idea is so prevalent that even the major Christian figure of the time is descending from ancient Egyptians. But for us and for our story tonight, a lot of the influence comes out of this particular expedition, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, and what happens after that when he takes a number of artists and scholars to Egypt with him, and they publish this very large set of books and drawings called The Description of Egypt. And when that makes its way around, particularly Europe, but then over to the Americas as well, this becomes a major source from which people are deriving inspiration for new architectural designs. So architects, artists, etc., are using these drawings that these artists made in order to come up with new designs for architecture. And in fact, what happens is it becomes the fad. And that's what you'll see as we go through a lot of this material, is that, just to sort of preface this, a lot of this was being used not because these architects and designers thought, oh, I really need something from ancient Egypt because I have this like Egyptophilia, right? That they just love ancient Egypt, or that it means something. It was actually just the hot style in the second half of the 19th century. So that almost everywhere you went and looked for style guides for designing, let's say, buildings, Egyptian designs were at the forefront of people's minds. So a lot of it sort of catches on and it becomes very faddish. Again, like that second phase in the Art Deco phase after 1920. Another thing that helps bolster the material coming out of the Napoleonic expedition is the decipherment of hieroglyphs in 1822. So then ancient Egypt starts to open up. We can read their inscriptions. The whole discipline that I'm a part of today is born out of this, right? The discipline of Egyptology, studying ancient Egypt. And so this really fuels a lot of this interest. And you see that reflected in some of these other places. For example, the World's Fair of 1893, which had a whole Egypt street. You can see the reconstructed Egyptian temple there in the photo. And some of these temples, this is from the Midwinter Fair in 1894. You might wonder, where are they getting these ideas to recreate these temples in these kind of fairs like this? Well, there were whole books, this one by Owen Jones called The Grammar of Ornament, architectural books giving you styles from ancient Egypt, of their columns, of their colors, of different designs. And so when you were an architect or an artist, you could go to a book like this and get ideas for how you're going to construct this or reconstruct this. Here are a few pages from that very book, The Grammar of Ornament, where you can see on the right-hand side these different Egyptian designs that that Owen Jones is copying out for people to use in their own construction, their own artwork, and their own architectural designs. Then at the end of this, or sort of more recent, the discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922 kicks off a whole new phase, this Art Deco phase, or I should say being combined with the Art Deco movement. And you see that in things like the DeKalb Egyptian Theater that we have out in DeKalb, and those places that I showed you earlier, right? The Reby Storehouse, the Egyptian Lacquer Company, et cetera. These are all part of this Art Deco movement. So again, just as an introduction, a couple things to take away. Number one, if we wanted to look at modern revivals, and these are artificial categories, but for the sake of dividing this up, you have one revival between about 1800 and 1900 that follows that Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1798, follows the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the decipherment of hieroglyphs. Then after that, you have this phase of the Art Deco movement and following the discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922, and then more of a 1940s to present, where you have all of this being incorporated into like pop culture, museums, academia, but then also all kinds of media, movies, films, now social media, memes, etc. So before we dive into more of this history of this architecture, a couple of things that I just want to, if you need a nugget to take away from the presentation today, number one, Egyptomania, the interest in ancient Egyptian history and culture did not begin with these modern events like the decipherment of hieroglyphs or the discovery of King Tut's tomb. It actually began in ancient Egypt. A lot of these traditions were then passed along through the centuries in various ways, again, that we could talk about more if you're interested. And then that gets passed down to us. And then those traditions often shaped how we perceive ancient Egypt even until today, which is why Egypt, for example, you might want to buy gold pyramid water because you might see Egypt as a source of knowledge, inspiration, mystery, exoticism, etc. All of that's being shaped in this. So what does that mean for the Egyptian revival in terms of architecture and style here in the US? Well, there's a couple things, again, I want to point out up front. Number one, a lot of times today, it's very common for us to have a sort of knee-jerk reaction to, let's say, how we acquired ancient Egyptian material, either in our museums or in inspiration for our designs. And, people will look at this and see a very colonial relationship between, let's say, how the big collections in America were built. But all I wanted to point out was already here in 1823, you had people in America like Edward Everett, who was a politician. He was a pastor. He was a US representative and senator, etc. But the main thing he's pointing out with the quote here on the screen is that they recognized that what was happening at the time in Egypt with largely Western, but not only Western powers sort of pillaging the materials out of the country, that was already being decried, right? They already saw this as a major problem and negative aspect of these relationships. So this is not new the way that we think about it today. Already in 1823, major people were seeing this. And part of this pillage that, again, gives us this interest in ancient Egypt in the West included collecting not just artifacts, but even people, right? Collecting human remains. And some of the earliest Egyptian materials in the United States are of human remains. So some of the earliest collections, for example, this mummy comes in 1823. It's one of the earliest mummified human individuals to come into the Americas. It was brought here by a Dutch merchant named Jacob van Lennep, and then he donated this person's remains to the Massachusetts General Hospital. It's still there. This is one of the earliest sets in America. We have Rubens Peale. He's an American artist and museum administrator. In 1826, there's two Egyptian mummies on display at his museum that ultimately he sells to P.T. Barnum, of the famous circus name, that goes into displays for them. And again, I'm just giving you sort of an overview here. There's somebody named Mendes Cohen. He's a colonel. This is actually known as the Cohen mummy nowadays, even though we do now know they were able to use imaging to read the actual name of the woman who was in this coffin. Her name is Amen-Ir-Dies, which just means Amen is the one who made her or who had given her. But this is one of the first private collections, in the US, donated to Johns Hopkins University in 1884, where it still remains. So these are some of these early Egyptian collections coming in at this time. And then finally, a very famous example in 1835, there was a man named Michael Chandler who picked up a set of Egyptian antiquities in New York that was collected by an Italian man named Lobolo. And he took this set, which included mummies and coffins and actually some papyri, and he was going around the United States and displaying them in the 1830s, and they were actually bought up by Joseph Smith, the famous Mormon prophet, and some of the papyri here ended up actually in his spiritual translation becoming parts of LDS scripture even today. So this is just to set the stage. This is what's going on in the early 19th century when we're getting this influence of ancient Egypt, where we're getting our information from. And one thing that's happening at this time when they're displaying a lot of these human remains, for example, is what were called mummy unwrapping parties. There's on the left is an advertisement for one. So this was very common. You might do this, like, let's say, at a wealthy person's house. They wanted to show off their materials that they brought back. So they would actually unwrap mummified human remains. Sometimes it happened at institutions. And just for the sake of full transparency, we're not immune from this. The two pictures that you see on the right, this is actually the former Oriental Institute in the early 20th century, where they were unwrapping human remains that we had in our collection, which are now partially unwrapped in our museum still. And just for the sake of not being gratuitous, I have blurred out the faces of these individuals on some of these slides, but these still exist in our collection. So the point that I just want to point out here is that this is the context for how we're experiencing as Americans ancient Egypt in the early 19th century. We're not coming at it from, let's say, some kind of objective perspective. It's getting influenced by all of these ways. So when it comes to designing our architecture and our ideas for art and design at this period, we're drawing on that sort of set of material where we're interacting with ancient Egyptian antiquities directly from these collections that are coming over in the early 19th century. But then obviously there's also a lot that we're getting from secondary places, one of which is through Freemasonry. Freemasonry is replete with ancient Egyptian symbolism and ideas. A lot of that was incorporated into Freemasonry by Alessandro Cagliostro and also by the German Carl Friedrich Koppen. And actually there was a lodge in Paris that Cagliostro was the head of, a Freemasonry lodge that had a temple to Isis connected to it. And so he incorporated a lot of what he called Egyptian rites into the rites of Freemasonry. And one place that we see that here in the United States is at this time, a lot of early settlers were Masons. And in fact, we have it, I'll show you here later, in Naperville, the city of Naperville, where I used to live, there's a cemetery there that has a big Egyptian mausoleum, Egyptian style mausoleum, and it belonged to a Freemason who built it there. And then he had both working partners, but then they intermarried into their families, where they built a similar mausoleum up in Two Rivers, Wisconsin. And they were all Freemasons. So you have all of these different influences coming together. One, Egyptian ideas in art and design were sort of hot at the time. These people were Freemasons, and their rites are all incorporating ancient Egyptian imagery within them, all happening sort of at the same time together. And of course, some of these rites from the Freemason material from Cagliostro is then incorporated into Mozart's Magic Flute, including an 1850 set design that was designed in Egyptianizing elements. And that sort of became the typeset for other productions of that later on. In addition to Freemasonry, there were artists and architects who were putting out design books. And this is probably one of the most influential ones of the time, Giovanni Piranesi. He was an Italian classical archaeologist, and also he apprenticed under his architect uncle, and he published a whole series of drawings. Some of them, like you see here, this is the Pyramid of Cestius at Rome. So this is a Roman period pyramid built in Rome that people in the second half of the 19th century would go visit when they took the grand tour. So when they would travel around the world, and particularly to Italy, and view these things, and they were getting inspired by that. But the other thing that Piranesi did was publish a number of basically themed fireplace designs that had Egyptian elements incorporated all throughout them. So these were published in 1769, and he saw Rome as a cultural capital influenced by the Etruscans through the Egyptians. And so he was designing all of this stuff with these Egyptian elements. I mean, some of it's very obvious, right? You see sort of the pharaonic style that you see a lot of this. Hellenistic style sphinxes. So that is sphinxes incorporating both Greek and Egyptian style for sphinxes. Here are a few other examples of these fireplace designs. At the top, you see the Apis bull, the ancient Egyptian Apis bull, the incarnation of the god Ptah. Hieroglyphic and pseudo-hieroglyphic inscriptions incorporated into this, because of course at the time of Piranesi, hieroglyphs were not yet deciphered, so they're just incorporating designs that they've seen from other material, like those obelisks in Rome. But here are just some of the designs that Piranesi put in these themed books that, again, were going out for the very purpose of influencing other people to make these designs and influence them they did. And people in America and in England also were influenced by that. One of the most famous examples of this, or actually maybe it's not so famous, you might be surprised by this, but Benjamin Henry Latrobe, he was an architect working on designs, and he actually came up with some designs for the first Library of Congress before it was built that were Egyptian themed style for the first Library of Congress. So this is some plans. This was never built, by the way. This was just a design that he submitted for this particular version. And so what you see when we get into the plans is you can see that along the top, we have the Egyptian columns. Notice in the bottom left, we have a temple style doorway, an ancient Egyptian temple style doorway. We can look a little bit closer. Here are the columns, some of the designs for how they were to be built. Again, coming right out of that grammar ornament type of material where you're picking up on these other design features, and then these temple doorways, some of which were based on buildings that had been built or were in the process of being built around the same time in England. For example, the one that you see on the right, which was the Egyptian Hall at Piccadilly, which was actually designed using drawings from Vivant Denon. Denon was one of these artists that went with Napoleon on that expedition in 1798, again, showing you these connections. Denon comes back, he has all these drawings of ancient Egyptian monuments. They inspire P.F. Robinson in England to build Piccadilly. That kind of style then influences people like Latrobe, who's designing this style for the early Library of Congress design. So this is spreading across the ocean, so to speak, from this expedition of Napoleon almost directly in some of these cases, and making its way to America in these designs. Another important architect at this time designing revival designs, both classical and Egyptian, was John Haviland. And you can see here, this is, he's designing in both neoclassical and Egyptian. And you can see this design for this building. If I remember correctly, this is, I can't remember. I think this might be the American, I think this is a fire building, if I remember correctly on the title of it. I'm not 100, I can't remember exactly. But what he's most famous for is this particular, here you go. Here's the Pennsylvania Fire Insurance Company. But he's actually most famous for this building, which is called the Tombs in New York. Has anybody ever heard of the Tombs? Yeah, the Tombs were a prison, exactly. A prison and a courthouse designed in Egyptian revival style between 1838 and 1897. And again, when you look at these, your first, the first question is, you go, why, right? Like, why design this as a big Egyptian temple with, the entire outside as the facade of a temple? You have the temple doorway, the pillars, the cavetto cornice at the top, the whole thing done in Egyptian style. Well, again, at the time, they tell us sort of why they picked it. Here's some quotes just to help give this context. The style of architecture which the committee have selected is the Egyptian, and the design is from one of the most approved examples found in Napoleon's Egypt. Again, coming right out of that Napoleonic expedition. It combines great beauty with simplicity and economy, and its massive proportions and general characteristics render it particularly appropriate and fit to the objects and intended use of the establishment. In its effect, this imposing monumental architecture created a sense of security thought sufficient to frighten would-be offenders and reassure the middle classes at the lowest possible cost. For this reason, it enjoyed a certain popularity at the time. And here are some other places that saw Egyptian-style prisons built in the 1830s. So this was, again, one of Haviland's designs. Again, just to, reinforce, they're not picking this because there was some connection to ancient Egyptian temples. This was just one of the styles that they had going on at the time. It was very popular. And in some ways, it connected to some of these notions of what we'll talk about in a little bit of what Edmund Burke had called the sublime. That is the imposing architectural style, the type of beauty, that's the lines, the aesthetics of it invoked certain feelings that were connected to it. You can see how it was described in this particular case. But we don't just have things like the tombs, the courthouse, the prison. We have Medical College, the Medical College of Virginia, built in 1845 with a similar design. And even, if you can imagine, Egyptian revival churches. So this one in 1848 in Tennessee, which maybe from the outside only looks like a superficial facade of Egyptianizing material, but when you look on the inside, it's quite the revival church with the entire sort of front altar done in Egyptian style and all the way around the windows as well, where you have these cavetto cornice, again, temple facade style designs going all the way around the room. So again, areas where people get surprised are you're building a building dedicated to Christian worship, right? In a style of ancient Egyptian paganism, you might say. We'll talk about that conflict here in a few minutes. But it's the same way that you saw even back in the Renaissance, where the popes were re-erecting these ancient Egyptian materials and then connecting themselves to it. And in fact, in some ways, some of those late Renaissance and later Egyptomania designs, they were incorporating ancient Egyptian elements, but then topping them with a Christian element or a papal element to sort of show the triumph of Christianity over paganism. So this was sort of all incorporated into it. But we have a number of these early churches that were designed with Egyptian revival style in the 1840s. Lots of them designed here. Some people have connected this with Calvinist denominations dedicated to their severe simplicity, but that's just a quote by Richard Carrott, who, by the way, if you want to read the book on Egyptian revival design in America, his book called The Egyptian Revival is really the primary source for it. So you see this at this time. So we've looked at some of these early examples, right? Pre-Library of Congress examples, the tombs, the stuff that's being done in the 1830s and 40s. This is early Egyptian revival in the United States. And from there, it spreads out to the cemeteries, where it takes on a particularly pervasive or ubiquitous presence at this time. So much so, actually, when you go to cemeteries in, let's say, from the East Coast to the Midwest, as I said, just driving by, you can sort of see the different chronological periods of the cemeteries, because, for example, you see a bunch of obelisks, you can sort of date that to around this period, 1850 to about 1925. Do you know a lot of people who want to put obelisks on their graves today? Not that many. This was a thing that the people were doing at the time. So even just driving by, you can use some of this and date the cemeteries, just seeing the type of monuments that are on the tombs. So in this, at this period, two things are happening. One, you have this growing interest in ancient Egyptian designs, and it's getting combined with the garden cemetery movement. So in the 19th century, as cemeteries in the cities and in the churches sort of filled up, and there were also sometimes hygienic concerns, they started moving cemeteries out to what at the time were basically the parks surrounding cities. And so that's why when you see places like Graceland, Roseland, some of these cemeteries that at one time were outside of the city, which are now sort of incorporated right in an urban environment, but they were set up to be these outdoor parks where you could go and sort of visit your family members or just sort of enjoy this, this environment. And a lot of the design, incorporating this ancient Egyptian design elements into this, were influenced by the idea of the sublime and the beautiful as expressed by Edmund Burke. We just talked about that a second ago. For example, here from Ronald Fritz's book, sublime buildings and monuments would provoke feelings of terror, awe, amazement, passion, and gloom, which were essentially the same powerful emotions that the ancient buildings engendered. And you can see this not just in buildings, but even in American literature. So, for example, here from Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, the Egyptian character of the masonry weighed upon me with its gloom. And this even appears in Moby Dick, where he's talking about the ancient Egyptian temple of Dendera. I won't read this all to you, but he mentions this. And of course, this is a reference to a famous section of the temple of Dendera that has a zodiac on it. That's very well known because it was blasted out with dynamite. The original is now in the Louvre, and what you see on the right-hand side is a recreation that was put back in the temple itself. But this is just to say, it's a very specific example, but just to say that this influence wasn't just in Egyptian architecture, but even in Egyptian literature. And some of the early individuals responsible for spreading it to the cemeteries were people like Alexander Davis, very influential architect at the time. He actually did submit a design for the tombs that was Egyptian revival style, but Haviland's won out over his, and a number of the early cemetery monuments in the United States with Egyptomania designs were designed by him. So you see the American Institute in the middle, but here on the right-hand side, you see the Robinson Mausoleum. That's from the Old Town Cemetery that's in New York State. Here's a picture of it more recently where it's still standing. Again, it has this sort of pyramid on top, but then that Egyptian temple facade on the front that's being pulled right from ancient Egyptian temple designs. And at this period, the number one place that you saw this, or I shouldn't say the number one, but one of the most prominent places that you saw these designs in these cemeteries was right at the cemetery gate. So a number of these early garden cemeteries in the United States, like Mount Auburn Cemetery, built large or sometimes quite massive Egyptian revival design gates leading you right into the cemetery. So here, the Mount Auburn Cemetery, this was designed by Jacob Bigelow. It was originally built of wood, but then because it didn't hold up very well, it was actually scrapped and then rebuilt in granite. That's the price that you see there. That's their price at the time. So in the 1830s, $9,535 to build it. And it has a quote from the book of Ecclesiastes on it. This is what you see sort of in many of these. You see this Egyptian revival design and then like a biblical quote stuck on the facade. Here's one from New Haven Cemetery designed by Henry Austin, completed in 1845. Again, a quote from the book of Corinthians this time. Here, Forest Hill Cemetery is 1848. Again, another biblical quote on the outside. But you can see they're all quite similar. They have this Egyptian gateway design, often with the pillars on the inside. So these were being built all around the 1830s, 1840s in some of the primary cemeteries or sort of prominent cemeteries in the United States, mostly again on the East Coast, as you see from the dates. Inside some of these cemeteries, we're actually building American pyramids. And one thing that we mentioned before is that there was pushback at this time from various people to say, why are we using pagan imagery and pagan monuments in our Christian burial places or for some of our even churches and other monuments? And so this is a little booklet that was published by Augustus Pugin, and where he basically is lambasting the use of Egyptian revival design. So I'll just read this to you because it's pretty funny how sort of clearly angry he is. And he's sort of roasting the Egyptian revival designers. He says, new cemetery companies have perpetuated the grossest absurdities in the building they have erected. The entrance gateway is usually selected for the grand display of the company's enterprise and taste, as being well calculated from its position to induce persons to patronize the undertaking by purchase of shares or graves. A caricature of the entrance to an Egyptian temple, 2.5 inches to the foot, is erected with convenient lodges for the policeman and his wife. So what he's saying here with the 2.5 inches to the foot, he's saying you go to Egypt and there's these grand giant monuments and we're making them on this little tiny scale and putting them at the front of our cemeteries, basically to impress you so that you buy a grave in the company's cemetery and patronize them. And it has a little lodge for the policeman and his wife and a neat pair of cast iron hieroglyphical gates, which would puzzle the most learned to decipher. While to prevent any mistake, some such words as New Economical Compressed Grave Cemetery Company are described in Grecian capitals along the frieze. So here he's pointing out that they're being written in Western letters, interspersed with hawk-headed divinities and surmounted by a huge representation of the winged Osiris bearing a gas lamp, which of course is the winged disc that we've seen on this. So he's just lampooning and arguing against the use of this. But this is from the Mount Auburn Cemetery. They published a little booklet around this time. You can see 1850, where they basically defend the use of this. They say, we are aware that an objection to these designs have been made and that they mark a period anterior to Christian civilization, but it has ever been a pleasure with the thoughtful to look beyond the actual appearance of a figure to the right development of its original idea. And so then they defend using this kind of design in cemetery designs, even for Christians in America burying their dead. And so we have a number of prominent examples here in Chicago, here from Graceland Cemetery. Probably the most famous one belongs to Martin A. Ryerson. You can see here in the image that it's designed based on the ancient Egyptian pyramid and also the ancient Egyptian mastaba. So the bottom half of this is designed on a mastaba tomb. That just is an Arabic word that means bench. And then it has the pyramid design on top of it. Now, this was designed for the original person buried here was Martin L. Ryerson. This is the father figure of the family, and it was commissioned and paid for by Martin A. Ryerson, his son, who's also buried in this mausoleum there. Just as an aside, in this particular case, Ryerson did have a bit of Egyptophilia, if you want to call it that. That is, he traveled to Egypt. He worked with a number of local Chicago institutions to actually make purchases of Egyptian artifacts. So in fact, at our institute, we have a papyrus that's often called Papyrus Ryerson because he gave the money for this to be purchased. This is a 30-foot papyrus that we have in our collection. This is just one little section of it. And this tomb that was built for the Ryersons was designed by Louis Sullivan, who's actually buried right behind this monument in Graceland Cemetery with a much later and totally different style headstone there in Graceland. But here are some of the designs, his working designs to put this together. Now, what I wanted to do is take a bit of a detour for a second to ask, what did ancient Egyptian pyramids symbolize that might have piqued some of these people's interest just beyond, let's say, the fact that they were popular in the design at the time? So first off, that I always like to point out is that a lot of people don't realize that there's actually well over 100 pyramids from ancient Egypt. There's not just a few that you know, like the ones that you see in the background of this image, which is the Giza pyramids, with another set of pyramids in the foreground. And so even though there's a lot of focus in our media attention on, let's say, the Great Pyramid, there are many pyramids from ancient Egypt and some in different styles, which we'll look at here in just a little bit. The ancient Egyptian word for this was mer. This is how they pronounced it. This is the word for pyramid. And in most, let's say, consensus ideas about what the pyramid symbolized, if you read, let's say, popular Egyptology books, most of the time they will talk about that it represents the mound of creation at the beginning of time that came out of the floodwaters in Egypt. Remember that ancient Egypt was along the Nile. The Nile would flood each year, and then as it went down, mounds of earth would appear, and that's where you would grow your crops and things like that. So people thought that this was associated with the mound of creation, and not just the pyramid, but also those mastaba tombs. So those mastaba tombs, like you see in the upper left on the image on the right, where you just had a simple rectangular structure on top of the ground with the burial underneath. Then you stack those mastabas up and you get a step pyramid, like we have in the step pyramid of Djoser from the 3rd dynasty. And then you fill in the steps to get your true pyramid. This is a very basic and rough and ready discussion of ancient Egyptian pyramid development. But it is thought that these pyramids then represented this first mound at the beginning of time. And there are some early texts that sort of suggest that this is from the pyramid text from Old Kingdom. So when we're talking about Old Kingdom, let's say we're talking around 2350 BC, that might connect these two together. And it also connects them to the top of the pyramid. So what we call the pyramidion, so the little pointy part at the top, which the Egyptians called the Benben stone. And that's actually what you find at the top of an obelisk. So these larger pillars with the Benben stone at the top, which influenced and inspired our use of obelisk from the ones in ancient Egypt, that they usually had flanking temple entrances, which then you see brought to America or London, like Cleopatra's Needle that you see in New York, but then also those erected on graves here in the United States. So let me just say, that's the consensus view that the pyramid symbolized this mound of creation, okay, that you see in some of these images. However, just to point out to give you the full picture, this view has now been challenged by a number of my colleagues out there who think that the texts aren't really specific at associating the pyramid shape with the mound of creation at the beginning of time. And actually what they think now, or at least a couple of my colleagues, not all of them, but some, they think that the pyramid is just associated with the royal power on earth, right? It's a symbol of the king and his power, and it doesn't necessarily have to be connected back to the beginning of time, sort of the creation at the beginning of the world, as many people have thought up until now. So that's just a sort of summary of what these some of my colleagues are saying. And so that's still being debated whether we're talking about a very religious symbol, okay, the pyramid as a symbol of the mound of creation, or just the pyramid as a symbol of the king's power on earth and his earthly stature. So that's just a little bit of a detour to suggest why people might be interested in them. And just to say, again, slight tangent, that people are still building such pyramids. This is for Nicolas Cage, the actor, who has built his own pyramid mausoleum to be used in the future. Now, you saw this pyramid of Ryerson here in Graceland that had the mastaba facade at the bottom with the pyramid on top. Right across a little street in Graceland from it is another pyramid mausoleum that belonged to Peter Schoenhofen. Peter Schoenhofen was a brewer in Chicago. Here are some of the early advertisements for his Edelweiss beer, but he had right next door to the Ryerson mausoleum a pyramid like this, much steeper, but you can see it had that Egyptian temple gateway at the front, a Victorian angelic figure, and then what you see in the lower right, a sphinx sitting flanking the doorway. Now, one thing that's really interesting about this particular mausoleum that was designed for Peter Schoenhofen is that it has some twins around the world. So this is a mausoleum of a man named Lucian Brunswick that was designed in 1893. So by Thomas Sully, and this was said to be based on a tomb in Brunswick, hometown of Munich. And there's also another tomb here that was even earlier designed for Francesco Bruni, which was built and erected in Milan in the monumental cemetery there. So if you look at all three of these, the reason I want to bring this up is you can see that they're all basically designed out of a pattern book. You have the very steep sided pyramid, you have the Cavetto cornice arched gateway for the doorway, you have the Victorian angel, in two cases both pointing back to the name of the owner of the mausoleum, and then they all have that Greco-Roman sphinx, or you might say Hellenistic sphinx in the bottom right. Now you can see that this is a very different style pyramid from like the ones that you saw on the Martin Ryerson tomb. And there's debate about where these were sort of inspired. On the one hand, we actually have tombs that look very similar to this from ancient Egypt. This is from a city called Deir el-Medina, where the private individuals, these were not pyramids that belonged to kings. These were high-ranking sort of noble people, elite people who were building their own pyramid tombs with these facades and gateways in the front. They all lived in this little village here. It could also be inspired, or maybe all of these are different inspirations that inspired different patterns that were being used in the 19th century and the 20th century. Could also be inspired by that pyramid of Cestius that we talked about earlier, or the pyramids out of Nubia that also had this very steep-sided design with temples in the front of them. So we're not 100%, at least I'm not 100% sure without some more research, when we look at these mausoleum like Peter Schoenhofen and others, exactly which element from the Egyptian designs that they're being pulled from, but we have a number that are similar enough that we know they're being developed from there. Finally, I want to talk very briefly, because we only have a few minutes left here, about sphinxes getting incorporated into American architecture, like the one that you see on some of these monuments, like the Schoenhofen Sphinx that we just looked at. But the most interesting maybe, or the most surprising of all of them, is actually one that was used on the flyer for this talk. And that's this one, again, designed by Jacob Bigelow. We heard his name earlier, and that was erected at Mount Auburn, that same cemetery that had the large Egyptian style gateway. In this case, what I would want to point out is obviously you have the Egyptian headdress. You have the style of this Hellenistic style Sphinx. Remember that for the ancient Egyptians, the Sphinx was a male. It's usually depicted as a male, often with the head of the king or something like that. But remember that the Sphinx in the Greek tradition was female, right? And it sort of stood at gateways, and right, you had to know the riddle to get by. In many of these cases, they're sort of melding those two styles, the neoclassical and the Egyptian, so you get this melded combination. But in this particular case, what is really interesting is notice the top of the headdress, where if this was an Egyptian sphinx, you would expect a uraeus, right? You would expect a cobra. Here you have a bald eagle. This was erected right after the American Civil War. And you can see here, this is incorporating this sort of American design, right? The American symbol, the bald eagle, into this Egyptomania design. Again, just showing you that there's symbolism involved, but a lot of this is just about the popularity of the designs at the time. And you can see these sphinxes when you go to many of these smaller mausoleums in cemeteries throughout the East and Midwest of the United States, flanking lots of these mausoleum styles. And as you can see, incorporating both the male and female aspects of these Hellenistic sphinxes, including those in our very own neighborhoods. This is the Friedley Mausoleum that I mentioned earlier, that's down in the Naperville Cemetery. You can see it has this Egyptian design on the outside, just like you've seen in some of these other ones, the Sphinx sitting out front. And the Friedleys were in business with another family called the Vossharts. And on the left, you can see the Vossharts Mausoleum in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, the Friedley Mausoleum here on the right in Naperville Cemetery. And just to show you very briefly, these are the two families. And notice that they ultimately end up intermarrying after Albert Friedley's dies, and then his wife marries one of the Vossharts. So they actually have some extended connections. And here are just some of the advertisements from their company, the metalworking company that they had together. And what were some of the things they were making? None other than designs, in this case, neoclassical designs, but based on some of these pattern books that you've seen. So when you go to places like Graceland, places like Naperville Cemetery, places like Roseland, all of these cemeteries around the Midwest, Two Rivers, you will find lots and lots of these examples of these Egyptian-inspired mausolea. And again, when you see them, 99% of the time, you can bet that these were built between 1850 and about 1920, because that's the time when this was really popular style. If you had the money to be able to afford it, you could incorporate that style into your monument, including, if you so chose, topping your grave with, for example, an obelisk like we have. Again, I'll just show you a quick Graceland example. Here we have a whole, this is all the Newberry obelisk from on top of Walter Newberry's grave, but there's actually a whole section of the cemetery that I call Obelisk Row, because when you walk down it, it's one obelisk after another. And so Walter Newberry had an obelisk on top of his grave. But just again, as another thing that might surprise you, what's the most famous obelisk in America?
Washington.
Yeah, the Washington Monument. Of course, again, built around this time and borrowing from these Egyptian themes. But what I didn't know until I read some of these books is that the original, or one of the original designs that were competing for the design for the Washington Monument was an Egyptian temple at the bottom. So here you can see the Washington Monument prior to 1884. You have that Egyptian style cavetto cornice over the doorway with the ringed sun disk. And some of the designs were really Egyptian inspired designs, where you can see like multi-level ancient Egyptian temples underneath this large obelisk structure, all for the Washington Monument design. So this was really just a part of the American fabric in this period, from courthouses, churches, Freemason lodges, the mausoleums on top of your grave, major political monuments, monuments to the Civil War, absolutely incorporated throughout all of these different designs in this period, again, from about 1850 to about 1920, when you have the Art Deco movement take over. So what are a few things we can take away, again, from all of these pieces and details? Well, again, one, Egyptomania was a constant theme from antiquity to the modern period, but Egyptian revival designs really gained popularity in two waves, one after 1800 and another in the 1920s and later. Egyptian styles were adopted, especially in Europe and the US, for the imposing size, graceful shapes, sublimity, and connections to ideas about ancient Egypt. All manner of architecture was affected: national monuments, state administration, businesses, supper clubs, and even individual private grave sites. And the Egyptian revival continues and is still seeing yet new waves emerge. And I really should have put something really good here for one of the modern ones, but maybe we can talk about it separately. So thank you very much. And I'll just say, if you're interested in this stuff, I mean, first off, you can always write to me at my email and I'll be happy to send you further literature. But this book on the right by Richard Carrott, The Egyptian Revival, that's probably the best book on it. The middle one by James Curl is also really, really good. And The Characteristically American. All three of these are really nice books. Another that branches out from, let's say, being specifically about the Egyptian revival in architecture and design, just to Egyptomania in general. Egyptomania by Fritz. The book on American hieroglyphs by Irwin, all about how this material got incorporated into American literature. And then Egyptland, also looking at this from sort of more race-conscious perspective. And then finally, there's a few museum catalogs all about Egyptomania as well. So any of this stuff is really great places to start if you want to learn more. All right, thank you.
Thank you.